Hello, comrades.
Hi, everyone.
And today we have Viktor Sechnoi in the studio. Hi, Vitya.
Hello.
This means we are talking about airplanes today. And today we have the second main character of our sim, the MiG-15, the fighter jet of Miko Yangurevic. We talked about the first hero, the Sabre, back in December. And today, that means it's time to talk about its primary opponent, its main rival over Korea. And the main thing, let's say this
Opponent?
his opponent in aerial duels. That's why when we talk about Korea, the Korean Air War, first of all, we certainly think about the battle between these two aircraft. And let's probably start with a brief introduction about the uniqueness of those aircraft as a phenomenon in history.
You could say that this is the first mass-produced Soviet fighter to feature a swept wing. That's the first thing. Secondly, it turned out to be the most mass-produced jet fighter in history. Over 15,000 units were built.
Do you mean absolutely all models, including the piston engine ones, right?
No, with piston engines, more piston engine models were built. Well, just other models. I'm talking about jet engines. I mean strictly jet fighters. So this is the first Soviet fighter with a swept wing, the first serial aircraft, I think, just with a pressurized cockpit that is for high-altitude flights. It was primarily created to combat the strategic bombers of the United States, such as the B-29, which were already beginning to appear, as well as the B-36. It had powerful armament, large caliber 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannons. And actually, because it was possible to obtain, there's a backstory about buying an engine from the English.
Well, yes.
Accordingly, there were two of them, the Derwent 5 and the Nene. That is, the Derwent was smaller and less powerful, and accordingly, the Nene was bigger. And basically, since Soviet developments in this direction were not yet ready, they completely copied this engine. As a result, everything worked out successfully in general. So essentially, it turns out that in parallel at that time, the development of the La-15 by the Lavochkin Design Bureau was also underway. That is
Also a jet plane.
Yes, also a jet aircraft, and accordingly, Lavochkin chose an engine based on the Derwent 5, which is actually the RD-500. On the other hand, the MiG engine was a copy of the Nene. The RD-45 and RD-45F were copies of the Nene 1 and Nene 2, respectively, and were more powerful, more successful, and more reliable accordingly. And since the Soviet government decided to unify aircraft production, that is, to eliminate the different number of types being produced, they chose, respectively, the MiG-15, and it actually fit very well into history.
It should be noted that this is probably one of the few cases in history where a Soviet fighter, based on its overall characteristics, took first place. Well, it's debatable, right? I mean, whether it was better than the Sabre, at least it shared the first place with the American fighter and was essentially unreachable for all other airplanes.
Let's say it didn't take first place, because if you compare the MiG and the Sabre, they are worthy of each other, just in different ways. Yes, that is, the Sabre has better...
I mean, besides these two, all the others were definitely much weaker.
Yes, if compared to the Meteor.
That is, yes, if you take the Second World War, yes, the best Soviet models at the time, yes. For example, by the end of 1944, there was significant progress, but they still had not reached the level of the Germans, who in turn had not yet reached the level of the Americans. So, roughly speaking, when we examine that particular moment in time, in particular the late 1940s, the Soviet industry had reached first place in terms of overall technical characteristics.
In general, yes, that is impressive. Again, to continue, if we talk about the Sabre, it has better horizontal maneuvering characteristics because it has flaps, a wing of slightly larger area, but it was significantly heavier, yes? But due to more advanced mechanization and a larger wing area, it had better horizontal maneuverability. Additionally, because the aircraft was heavier, it accelerated more effectively in a dive. And accordingly, the MiG ended up in an interesting situation. By the way, it turned out to be the opposite. That is, if in the Second World War, our pilots mainly acted defensively, yes, because the Germans occupied the higher altitudes, so ours had to maneuver. However, here it turned out to be the opposite. The MiGs, after the first attack, went up, meaning they lured the Americans to a higher altitude as it had better climb characteristics. In terms of speed, they were roughly comparable. Well, the Sabre was just a bit faster, by about 20 kilometers per hour, so just a little bit.
We'll discuss the characteristics in more detail later and compare them with the Sabre, as it's most interesting to compare them. What could be more interesting? Let's now talk about the history of the aircraft.
So the history of this aircraft begins in 1947. That is, accordingly, the government approved the program for creating an aircraft with a swept wing. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, several aircraft were being developed in parallel. The leading competitor was the Lavochkin La-15. Accordingly, Yatish in 1947, the first prototype he called the S1, so flew with an English Nene-1 engine. Accordingly, a little later, they improved it. At that time, it was still an aircraft without air brakes. So accordingly, a bit later, the second one flew, the S2 prototype, which already had the Nene-2 engine, and then later the S3. That is essentially, they introduced all these improvements, which included adding larger air brakes. Yes, and even with increased area, even more increased area ones appeared a bit later on the BIS models. Accordingly, brake flaps were added there. And approximately in the year 1950, that is actually just regarding the motor, yes, the RD45 and RD45F were essentially copies of the English motor. Accordingly, Klimov's design bureau, which produced the engines, had already created an improved version of the VK1 engine, meaning it was slightly larger. That is, if the RD45 had 50 blades, they're mainly accordingly, the VK1 had 52, I believe, with 500 kilograms per second more thrust. So it was a large improvement over the original. That is, if the Nena had, I think, 2,270, then the VK1 already had 2,700 kilograms thrust.
Well, that's quite an increase.
Quite healthy, yes. That is when compared.
The MiG-15, yes, essentially was the RD-45, RD-45F. Then there is the MiG-15 BIs, which flew in 1950 and began serial production. It was a plane with the VK-1. Speaking of speed, in terms of improved characteristics, its speed slightly improved by 20 kilometers per hour, but the climb rate has been significantly improved. So if we're talking about the MiG-15, it's usually 2 or 3 minutes, I think, to 10 kilometers. Not 2 or 3, but 5.9, I think. Yes, to an altitude of 10 kilometers in 5.9 minutes. The MiG-15 BIS climbed 1 minute faster.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, climb rate is important for this type of fighter, and this one is actually more of an interceptor than a fighter.
Yes, so this is very important.
Yes, but of course the tactic itself, as shown also by the Korean War, the tactic of attacking large formation bombers is essentially the same boom-zoom we know from the Second World War, but performed at some downright cosmic altitudes. There, the formation of bombers is at an altitude of, how much is it, 7 to 8 kilometers. I think the B-29s flew at, right?
30,000 feet.
Yes.
9,000.
Right, and so you have to be above them, that is above 9,000 meters, dive and attack, and from this high altitude, from 9 kilometers, climb again and repeat the attack. The unique climb rate characteristics which made the MiG-15 the best in the world at that time, even surpassing the Sabre, enabled it to do this. But here we smoothly transition from history to characteristics, and since we've started discussing attacks on bomber formations, let's talk about the main difference between the MiG-15 and the Sabre, specifically its armament, which can't truly be called artillery.
Yes, actually, the armament of the MiG-15 consisted of 137mm N37D cannon and two 23mm cannons. The early models had NS-23s. Moreover, initially, the idea was to install the NR-23 cannons, which are more rapid firing, on the MiG-15 bays. However, due to incomplete installation, they were introduced slightly later. We ultimately chose the MiG-15 BIS as the base modification, equipped with NS-23 cannons. As a modification, you can also select the improved version with NR-23 cannons. Accordingly, the guns themselves have a 37mm caliber with 40 shells per gun. That is unfortunately not many, but if it hits... Yes, and accordingly, for the 23mm guns, there are 80 shells per gun.
80 is fine.
If we discuss the guns themselves, as I mentioned, we're getting the mods. The NS-23 had a rate of fire of 600 rounds per minute, while the NR-23 had 800.
And what about the 37 millimeters?
The 37 has 400, I think 450 like that.
Oh, actually, the aircraft's armament reflects its main task, because when the task is to shoot down a massive 4-engine bomber, doing it with small caliber weapons like a 50 caliber 12.7mm machine guns or 20mm cannons like the Schwak with a weakened cartridge, yes, it will be a very difficult task. That is, of course, you can't come poke holes in it, maybe even make some holes in one tank, but it will be of little use. It will reach the target and drop its bombs. And here it is necessary to reliably destroy the aircraft or force it to make an emergency landing.
Well, yes, in this case, the weight of a 1-second volley plays a role, namely to inflict maximum damage in the shortest possible time.
In the Navy, there's a saying, a big torpedo for a big ship. Here, it's the same story. To shoot down a big bomber, you need a big projectile. That is why this aircraft adopted such a weaponry concept, which created some problems in aerial combat with fighters, because 80 rounds per gun of a 23mm cannon is, of course, good, but
Not very much, yes.
Not very many, and engaging in a protracted aerial battle with an enemy fighter might not be enough. Listen, well, about the cannon.
of the MiG-15. After all, it actually traces its history back to an anti-tank gun, right?
Yes, initially so it was assumed that larger caliber cannons in the Soviet Union would be installed on fighters for engaging tanks. So starting with the Spitalny cannon, then the SHA-37, and later the NS-37 Nudelmann. Well, roughly speaking, based on the Germans' experience most likely for intercepting 4-engine bombers when they used the Mk-108, Mk-103, that is 37mm cannons with a large amount of high explosive charge, they had...
Explosives.
Yes. So accordingly, the N-37 cannon is essentially the logical evolution of the NS-37 cannon. It's more compact and shorter, meaning the projectile speed is lower, I think, around 600 to 700 meters per second. Still, at the same time, the rate of fire is significantly higher, 400 rounds per minute. However, the projectile is essentially the same. It's a high explosive incendiary tracer, and it's about a 700-gram weight.
Show the image, which actually looks like this, about the size of this control stick, possibly even larger.
Yes. I don't remember the exact amount in grams. Well, the only thing is the charge, if compared with the Germans. If compared with the Germans, yes, let's say they were Meningeschoss, those ones. But at the same time, the gun itself, well, the projectile, it is more massive, right? So more fragments, yes, but less explosive, however. But due to its rate of fire, it can be painful in that regard. The same can be said about the NS-23 gun, yes, NR-23. They use the same shells in these guns, but essentially they use the same projectile as on the Vaya gun, the projectile itself. But at the same time, its shell casing was shorter, and accordingly, due to the high rate of fire, there in general, NR-23 and NS-23 too, it was quite a punch. Because if we look at the experience with the IL-2, the VY cannon, there's the shell. It's like, again, when you look at photographs, it's only 3mm bigger. But when you look at the shell there in the museum, well, there the shell is twice as big. Yes, if you look at the cannon itself, you can see the HVAK and the VY cannon, like that, yes.
That is, the shell itself is very powerful for such a weapon, that is.
Listen, well done. When they fired such a massive shell, the recoil must have been something else, right? How did they manage it?
Well, basically, it has a, how to say, free barrel movement. So the gun jerks back and forth. Again, there's a great video of how Americans tested firearms, shooting the gun on the ground. You can clearly see it going boom, boom, boom. So
Looks serious.
So it had a long barrel travel, right?
Number short barrel travel.
And the short one?
And the short recoil of the barrel.
And the muzzle brake?
Muzzle brake, yes.
Oh, and the muzzle, some kind of slotted one, right?
it's like a flash suppressor there, mainly to slightly reduce recoil. And there, the gun itself is positioned close to the air intake, allowing it to disperse, because if the gunpowder gases enter the air intake, it can cause engine surge.
Listen, on the MiG-15, they mostly used belts with high explosive fragmentation shells, right?
Every other one, I think.
Armor piercing.
There's API. Yes, there were armor piercing, of course.
And 37 too.
I think so, yes.
Why 37mm AP rounds to penetrate the bomber through?
Like, yes, from the tail to the nose. When the projectile, well, hit mostly, of course, I think they loaded explosive ones there. I think depending on the task, yes, that is.
Again, well, I think you can...
Are there really no examples of when this big, massive thing hit a fighter and something happened?
Well, there are photos, yes, where the pilot is actually standing in the hole. Yes, it says it's possibly from the N-37, but it's unclear whether it's actually from the NR-23. But judging by the description, it tore out, a square, like 1 or 2 square meters of the wing. So basically, it is just what I was talking about, the fact that Pepeliev did shoot down a Sabre with this. I was just hit by a 37mm shell, which hit the fuselage behind the cockpit, and couldn't eject. So because this ejection seat failed, he landed on the shore.
Oh, really?
The jet systems, in principle, not that jet planes themselves are larger than propeller planes. They are generally more durable. Therefore, one hit could still be survived. Yes, that is to say. But with 2, most likely, that's it. Yes. Plus, again, where it hits depends on luck. It could vary.
Well, it's probably spectacular, right? When you shoot from this thing, there are explosions going on.
Yes.
Yeah, so you fly, you're racing on this thing, shooting, and your whole target right there. There are big blasts. Yes, the entire target, as if it came under anti-aircraft artillery fire from the ground. Yes, and you set all this up. Cool, probably. All right, let's move on then.
Let's discuss the weaponry further. What else does it have besides the cannons?
It was also planned to attach 2 external fuel tanks, each with capacity of 250 liters. So a bit later, 400 and 600 liters appeared, but these were not used in Korea. Alternatively, bombs could be hung on these hard points. A FAB 100 or FAB 50, we have the FAB 100. So fuel tanks, and specifically the so-called Klingon type, each with a capacity of 250 liters. That's basically it. So mostly just a fighter.
Uh-huh, right. And with the large external tank, what was its range?
There. I remember without tanks. 1,200 something. With tanks.
Radius or range?
Precisely the range.
Range.
Yes, with tanks it was a bit more. There's only time listed. Duration up to 2 hours and 57 minutes. Yes, the range, well, I assume it's about 2,000 probably.
Mm-hmm. So its combat radius was 800 kilometers with tanks, right?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Let's discuss its other systems. The engine is the most interesting as it differs significantly from the Sabre.
Yes, accordingly, we have centrifugal 1 with a centrifugal compressor, this very VK1, while the Sabre respectively has an axial compressor. And the Sabre had slightly less thrust there, I think, also 300 to 400 kilograms per second less.
This, by the way, is surprising. Although you might think, yes, the design of a jet engine with a centrifugal compressor, well, in general, is more archaic by today's standard-wise, let's say, right? Nevertheless, the engine turned out to be more advanced in terms of its characteristics.
Yes, but the way one version is that the reason the English sold us this engine is that by that time they believed but designed with a centrifugal compressor had outlived its usefulness as it was already becoming obsolete.
Well, not exactly.
Yes, it turned out that it wasn't.
By the way, I forgot, did we buy the engine from them? Did we manufacture it legitimately or under a license, or did we use a similar method like the Chinese?
Without a license.
So like the Chinese, right?
Well, back then already, when I forgot the Fulton speech by Churchill in 1946, I think, or in 1947, well, not the point. At that moment, during the negotiations, I believe the story goes like this. The delegation, consisting of Yakovlev and Mikoyan, visited an exhibition in Paris and saw this engine. Then, accordingly, they agreed with the English representatives to buy it. Here's where Stalin immediately said, what fool would sell their secrets? But in the end, there's a story, unknown if it's true or not. It's, I think, from Mikoyan's book, Stepan Anastasovich, who visited our office.
Yes.
The book is called We Are Children of War, I think, and that's where it is from, if I remember correctly. Well, supposedly he wrote, based on memories from his father's words, something like that Mikoyan played billiards well, and they, jokingly with the trade representative, I think, for instance, if I win, we'll then sign a contract accordingly. And Mikoyan was good at billiards, so he won. Well, and I think it's unlikely that this is the main, well...
A plot worthy of a James Bond series.
Yeah, but back then, it was still more or less fine relations, meaning the Iron Curtain hadn't entirely fallen yet. So they were just starting to strain relations, right? So I think they managed to buy it, and after that, everything there... The English were then harassed a lot for this. Well, that's how it turned out.
By the way, it can be noted that all jet planes, even already
First generation, yes, but also the second, to which we are, so to speak, in our vision of the generational lineup, include the Sabre and the MiG-15. They are all equipped with brake flaps.
Yes.
And this is caused by the fact that piston engine with a propeller has very good responsiveness. The speed changes very quickly and power is added very quickly. Yes, well, plus the propeller itself is somewhat akin to an air brake. Yes.
And you're right, which when you reduce the throttle, but the RPM or rapidity decreases, causing the pitch to change to a larger or smaller value. It always get them mixed up. So when the propeller blades create air resistance, the propeller itself also acts as an air brake in this case, no?
Yes, and to bring this jet engine to full throttle, it probably takes about 30 seconds, right?
Yes, responsiveness is less.
Yes, and roughly speaking, to maintain a set speed at low speed, for example, on the glide path, you have to use the air brakes.
Yes. Additionally, all this significantly affects maneuverability in aerial combat, because when you enter a turn at high speed, without air brakes, there will be a high overload. Well, roughly speaking, the pilot might quickly pass out. In this case, when entering a turn, you can deploy the flaps, sharply lose speed, and thereby cut the angle. This, by the way, was one of the significant advantages of the Sabre, because it had a significantly larger flap area. And actually, right around the end of 1952, they began to experiment installing more, that is the MiG, specifically the MiG-15, had, if I remember correctly, approximately half a square meter of flap area. So they started experimenting by placing an increased area overlaid directly over the old flap, reaching up to 0.8 meters. On combat units, they specified that we will have one of the modifications, thus enlarged flaps. Right there in Korea, they installed retrofitted enlarged flaps and used them on combat machines.
Another interesting difference between the two planes, as we compare them, is the cockpit canopy.
Yes, on the Sabre, the view from the cockpit is, of course, much better. There's a seamless canopy and the pilot sits high, so visibility is good. The MiG-15 is worse in this regard, yes, because its rear part is framed and also the canopy is lower, yes. There is also massive bulletproof glass in the front. The Sabre also featured bulletproof glass, but the canopy itself was slightly larger.
This trend among Americans for large canopies with good visibility began around 1943 or 1944, right?
By the way, Mustang, yes, accordingly the first one.
It's essential to note that in combat conditions, because one could argue that the Japanese were the first to adopt this design, as they used it on the Zero, which also featured a teardrop-shaped canopy. Well, actually, the Soviets had them much earlier. That is, at the end of 1942, the beginning of 1943. On the Yak-1, a teardrop canopy was introduced. And for Americans only, from 1944, yes, it turns out, from the spring of 1944 on, Mustangs. And the Thunderbolts began to appear a little later, featuring a teardrop canopy. For the British, it was at the end of 44, and in 45 only.
And the trend continues to this day. That is, interestingly, even now from their basic concept, they somehow deviated slightly. Yeah, if you take the F-16 fighter, yes, it is a true heir of the Sabre with a huge teardrop canopy and perfect visibility. However, on the F-35, for some reason, they reverted to a canopy with a frame.
I think it's related to the fact that they use this concept, namely a transparent cockpit. That means the cameras are just in place. A large canopy means large resistance, and it shines from a distance, yes?
Also the conditions of a nuclear explosion. I'm afraid this all doesn't work very well, and then the pilot will have to rely only on their own eyes. Okay, let's set that aside.
I think it's more likely related to that.
Another interesting difference is the method of how they fight on the MiG-15. Specifically how Mikoyan addresses the wing flow on a swept wing towards the wingtips. If on the Sabre they use so-called fangs, also known as turbulators, for this purpose.
Fangs came later on the so-called 6-3 wing, I think. That is the only thing, is that they put just two. There were no turbulators yet. These were just guides at the wing route. And
on the MiG, they used actual ribs for this.
Yes, I think that in this case, specifically due to the aerodynamic design, the Sabre was a low-wing aircraft, which made it more stable. The MiG-15, on the other hand, was a mid-wing, so it was less stable. Moreover, basically because of those ridges, there was a problem. I think Pepeliaev wrote about how at low speeds it was okay, at high angles of attack, but in a dive it became sluggish, and it was very difficult to turn using yaw.
Ah, so they additionally stabilized for slipping.
That is, the Sabre used its advantage, yes, by diving away, and it was very difficult to catch up with it there to shoot. Plus, the MiGs had a problem, actually, in the design, yes, that is, well, it was indeed the first jet fighter design experience and all that, yes. The wing wasn't rigid enough, which led to what's known as the tumbling effect. Because the wing bent differently, the pilot's stick would tilt, and it was very hard to counteract that moment. In this case, you could have used your foot, but due to the ridges and the load, it was really difficult at that moment.
I see. And the plane was still without boosters.
The booster had, boosters in the aileron channel.
The ailerons had boosters.
Starting from the piste, we installed a booster for now on the ailerons. That's it. And for the Americans, I think there was also a booster in the elevator channel, not just in the ailerons.
I don't remember which model introduced the hydraulic drive for the elevator.
No, they initially had an amplifier from the very beginning, yes. And starting with version E, they changed the control of the elevator itself, meaning it has...
I remember everything now, yes, regarding the stabilizers.
On the A version, there was just an amplifier, but on the E version, they had already implemented a hydraulically controlled drive, yes? Yes.
Well, listen, we have covered a lot about the design. There's still a lot more that can be said about the landing gear features and radio equipment, because there's a battle there too, right? Between Sword and Shield. They installed the radar rangefinder on the Sabre.
Yes, that's already one of the main advantages. Well, you could say that in principle, more experienced pilots did not like this thing. Yes, that is, I believe, in the memoirs of Gabreski. He was an ace in the Second World War. He supposedly stuck gum on the windshield. Plus, there were also early sights. First of all, the climate in Korea, with its sharp temperature fluctuations and high humidity, was a significant factor. So these early sights often failed. There is an interesting point about the Sabre. On models with the sight, there was an A1C sight. Because it often failed, they would just replace it with the old Mark 18, meaning like a gyroscopic sight, that one.
And on the MiG, accordingly, they immediately attached...
The MiG-15 was equipped with an ASP-1, which is a copy of the Mark II-D English sight.
No, I mean this. About the buzzer.
Oh, about the beeper. Yes. Actually, in 1952, I think, there was a radio engineer named Maskiewicz with the Soviets. Yes, there are interesting memoirs. Accordingly, when Pepeliaev shot down a Sabre in October 1951, I think, on this Sabre there was an APG-30, so precisely this radio rangefinder. And there, it was actually tested, and Maskiewicz realized it was a rangefinder. So essentially, as I understand it, the device of this detector is like a circuit tuned to the emission frequency and wavelength. And accordingly, as soon as the airplane was exposed to this rangefinder sound signals, and the light would go off, right? There we go. We'll have a similar modification as well. The only thing is the control panel itself. So again, all according to the memoirs, right? It says there that a volume knob and a toggle switch were added. We'll have a dial and a toggle switch, and also a light on that very...
And by the way, is this perhaps the first example in history of installing a radiation warning system on a fighter, right?
No, the Americans had an active system, the very same RPG-13, which was installed on the Mustang as an attack warning radar.
No, I mean the radiation warning system, I believe that's what it was.
No, the English had it too, so did the Germans and the Germans themselves. That is a detector.
For the night fighters, right?
Yes.
On bombers.
There was already such a thing, yes. And on German night fighters too.
Well, the idea, let's say, isn't exactly new, right?
Yes.
Yeah, well, all right.
Let's probably move on to the final part, but it's no less interesting. It's, in fact, the combat use of this aircraft in the skies of Korea.
Yes, so accordingly, initially, that is, the planes were supplied to cover the territory of China. Accordingly, it turns out that in 1949 to 1950, right? So again, at the same time, they retrained Korean and Chinese pilots there. That's when, accordingly, the Soviets deployed MiGs to cover the Korean territory around November 1950, right? That is the first delivery. The first aerial combat actually took place in November 1950, and the first aerial battle against the F-86 occurred in December 1950. Again, originally, the Soviet side initially used the MiG-15, yes. For the Americans, it was a surprise because against the F-80 and F-84, it had a serious advantage. And accordingly, they urgently redeployed, probably using carriers. This was a common practice for them. So the plane doesn't need to be disassembled and reassembled, right? They just put it on the deck with a special coating, right? So they can quickly transfer it back and forth, right? They assembled it if necessary, and then transferred it from Japan to Kimpo, where it was used against the MiG-15. And in principle, the first air victory of the Sabre was over the MiG-15, because the Soviets thought, like, well, what is this? Probably our MiGs.
Well, the swept wing is visible. They are our own.
And a little later, Soviet pilots also started shooting down Sabres.
And it was put into service, or that is, it turns out, in the skies over Korea, Soviet Union pilots who were advisors fought in the MiG-15.
Well, like we're not here.
And pilots from China who were kind of volunteers, well, and actually Korean pilots of the Korean Air Force too, right? That is, and they all flew in the livery exactly like...
Yes, when delivering the MiG-15, the Soviet Union markings were immediately removed. More precisely, Korean identification markings were painted over them, right? So right over the star with the Korean identification markings. And when operating over the territory of Korea, yes, so Soviet forces, the Chinese and the Koreans, well, the Koreans, of course, flew with the North Korean identification markings. That's it.
But they were based, I think, at different airfields, right?
Yes, the Soviets were mostly based on the territory of China, right? That is in Antun, right? So they're near the Yalu River, specifically on Chinese territory close to the border, and accordingly the Koreans on Korean territory had their own airfields there, which were often unusable. That is, the Americans seriously targeted the airfield network, plus they had many more forces allocated, right? Since the Soviets operated mainly in a defensive capacity. The Americans were essentially hammering everything they could. The MiGs had a significant impact on the actions of the bombing force. That is, this is April 1951, and I always confuse Thursday and Tuesday.
Yes, there was Tuesday and there was Black Tuesday. However, on Tuesday, the losses were much larger, several times larger.
That is, accordingly, the first major losses occurred in April 1951. The first one, and accordingly, either Tuesday or Thursday, is also October 1951. And actually, after these losses, they converted the B-29s to only nighttime operations and stopped flying during the day. So basically, the Americans realized that the strategic bomber wouldn't reach the target area where it needed to drop its payload. And in general, the MiG-15 seriously affected this. This is specifically the merit of the MiG-15.
By the way, and incidentally, since the show is now coming to an end, this makes for an excellent conclusion, as the MiG-15 accomplished 100% of the task for which it was created, specifically designed to intercept the heavy four-engine bombers of the United States. And it fully succeeded in this task.
100%.
Yes, and it certainly changed both the course of the war itself and the evolution of aviation development. Because, in fact, after this, the evolution of bomber aviation went in a completely different direction. The speed race began, right? Accordingly, the speeds of bombers started to increase. They eventually became supersonic, precisely for this reason, because it turned out that slow, albeit heavy, carrying a huge number of bombers armed with an enormous number of turrets. Nevertheless, they turned out to be quite vulnerable against fast interceptors.
Yes, but it should also be noted that to cover the bombers, you need to take a more advantageous position with the escort fighters, right? But in this case, since the MiG has a higher ceiling and rate of climb, so it had a more advantageous position, right? That is, breaking through the cover barrier at high speeds with a dive is much easier, yes? Rather than trying to catch up from below and intercept, that's it, basically.
Yes. Well, let's maybe in conclusion have a couple of episodes, literally a couple of the most interesting episodes from the Korean War.
Well, that's Black Thursday. Black Thursday, that's when a large number of bombers were intercepted and they suffered almost 1/3 serious losses. Yes.
And who was the best ace of the Korean War? So again, 22 victories.
22 victories specifically over Korea.
Yes, specifically in Korea, yes. I think Pepeliev had 19, but that's official, so perhaps historians have now found something, yes. But mainly, I believe it's with Pepeliev, yes, that the opposing side confirms the most victories, that is the American side.
That is, yes, and yes, that was exactly my next question. Are these 19 to 22 victories documented victories?
Not all, of course. I think for Pepeliev, 12 out of 19 are confirmed. Well, that's...
Because it is an eternal and very interesting debate.
Yes, well, the thing with the Americans was that when a bomber flew all full of holes, made it to Japan, crashed, the plane was beyond repair, but it wasn't counted as shot down in combat in the official report. That's great.
And those 20 holes from 37 millimeters, did they just appear by themselves, right?
It is, of course, that it was from both sides, yes.
Well, yes. So it's completely international.
Yes, again, if they're...
Everyone did this.
I read about the MiG-15 of the same Pepeliev. Yes, that is when in 1951 they arrived. Mainly, they were experienced pilots. Yeah? Yes, that is, they fought in the Second World War. Also, Pepeliev placed great emphasis on training. Accordingly, when in spring 1951 they were replaced by other units. There, accordingly, losses seriously increased. Firstly, yes. Again, this is, you could say, a tradition of underestimating the enemy. Yes. So they achieved the first victory and accordingly became complacent. The Americans acted systematically, yes, that is gradually building up forces and so on, and accordingly the Chinese and Koreans also entered the battles. Their training was significantly worse. Well, they certainly improved over time, especially the Chinese. They also had aces there, so that's how it was.
I think that at the end of the year, we can do an episode about the Korean War aces.
We should, yes.
A rather unexplored topic, because everyone knows the most famous names. But here, overall, there's not much known about the Chinese and Koreans. It would certainly be interesting. Well, friends, we're probably going to wrap up here. I hope you found it interesting. There will be many more stories about airplanes, but essentially we will increasingly move on to the course of the war itself and other types of objects. Be sure to follow the releases of our dev brief videos, keep an eye on the developer diaries, and subscribe to our social media for updates. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Write comments, ask questions. We will try to answer in the comments. Thank you very much, Victor, for being with us in the studio today. Stay in touch.
Bye, everyone.